doing squats, right? Greetings and welcome to Wyldwood Wargaming. Games Workshop were very, very kind in sending me all of the new Squat Prospector stuff for Necromunda. I got the Book of the Ancients, the new Exo-Kyn, the Trikes, and some cards as well. So thank you to Games Workshop for sending those to me. As soon as I saw these Exo-Kyn come out on the Warhammer community, I knew that I wanted to start painting them. The first thing that stood out to me is the lack of real detail on these guys, which is great because I do think that a lot of Games Workshop miniatures are overly detailed at times. So I knew straight away with all the armor plating on these Exo-Kyn that what I wanted to do is my usual thing of really making them look like they're going to give you tetanus when you pick them up. So these grumpy, dumpy little bearded boys and girls are going to get painted in my style with a few secret little ingredients and recipes. I'm using pigments, I'm using oils, I'm using contrast paint, and a bunch of other techniques which are really simple and easy to achieve. So stay tuned for this one. I also think if you play like Horus Heresy and you want to do Death Guard or something, this is probably quite a good scheme for that too, because what we're going with is a very muted, dirty, messed up sort of off-white bone color here, which I'm really happy with the results for. So without further ado, let's get into these bearded little boys and girls. All right, let's get into it then. A Squat Prospector Exo-Kyn here with the dual power fist, looking like he's going to power himself up like Henry Cavill. I've decided after much deliberation not to go with many colours here. I'm literally going to go with the primer of Wraithbone over Mechanicus Standard Grey here, a slight zenithal. What I'm going to do here is actually stick with the primer as my base coat and coat the entire thing in Seraphim Sepia. I absolutely love Seraphim Sepia. It's a great wash. I tend to use it on most things, and usually, and I've done a few other painting tutorials here where I've actually used Seraphim Sepia over my base coats before even getting into the painting, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. I'm going to coat the entire model over that Wraithbone with Seraphim Sepia to look like I've sort of dunked this guy in a pot of English breakfast tea. So that's the sort of look I'm going for here. This gives us the sort of foundations for the color that we're going for on the armor, but also any other colors that I'm going to add to it as well. This isn't going to obscure anything. It's not going to, you know, the only other colors I'm going to be using are going to be darker than this. So it's absolutely fine to use this with contrast paints over the top as well. But we're going to coat this fairly liberally and wait for that to dry and move on to the next step shortly. Even if you miss bits at this stage, I mean, try and be as thorough as you can, but even if you miss a few bits here and there, it doesn't matter because we're going to go over this and do many other washes, oil washes, and other types of rust and corrosion on this guy that will obscure any of that anyway. So, you know, don't be too careful. In general, I find that my painting process is quite messy and quite artistic. I prefer to paint this way. I don't paint like an heavy metal guy. So if you're into that kind of style, edge highlighting and all that, go and watch a different video because this is grimdark, that's for sure. All right, so the Seraphim Sepia wash has dried. We're now going to go in with some Wyldwood, which is a quite warm sort of brown here. Quite a dark brown. I'm going to use this in all the sort of crevices and creases and cracks in the armor. He is wearing a sort of bodysuit under the armor. So we're just going to sort of coat those details underneath in the cracks of the elbows and the backs of knees, just like you have Space Marines actually. They've got those sort of rubber patches in between their armor plating. That's what we've got here. I'm going to do it with a brown because I just feel like brown kind of suits the rest of the model where we're going with this. We're going to be using a hell of a lot of different browns here. And I feel like if I use black, it would just be a little bit too stark. So with the brown here, just carefully with a thin brush going over those little creases and crevices. Again, don't be too careful here if we get any of this contrast paint on the armor plates themselves. It's absolutely fine because we can clean up later with some Wraithbone. So I've done inside the elbows there. I'm now going to do the backs of the knees and the sort of butt area on this little dumpy guy. He's got quite a cute little peachy butt underneath there. So caressing that with the paintbrush accordingly. This will just make those armor plates pop a little bit more once we get going with the rest of the armor. So that's the Wyldwood, the first contrast paint that we've used here. The next thing I'm going to be using is a quick dry brush of the original base primer color of Wraithbone. Now this is a dirty old pot and I've not got much left. I'm going to be using a makeup brush here. You can get these from most sort of pharmacists. They're pretty cheap. You don't need anything fancy. Just basic makeup brushes here will do the trick. Just make sure that when you're using this these base paints can be quite chalky. So wet the brush a little bit, damp it down a little bit before, and then wipe it on a paper towel to remove the excess paint. Just try to keep it a little bit moist when you're doing your dry brushing. The thing here as well is to sort of hit it from the top down. I don't want to be coming upwards and doing any upwards motions on this. It's really trying to recreate a little bit of light splashing down onto this dumpy little guy from above. I'm not going over the top here, just a little bit of a light dry brush just to catch the edges of the armor plates and any sort of details that might pop out on the backpack there, on the fists and elsewhere on the model. Nice. Now that's done. You can see he pops just a little bit more. I've brought back some of the brightness in the original Wraithbone underneath. Now what we're going to do is do a tiny weeny little bit more of Pallid witch flesh, which is slightly colder and lighter off-white here. I'm just going to do a slight bit of edge highlighting just on those raised edges on the armor plates and the rivets. It's really important to catch the rivets here because they will pop later on when we do our sort of rusty battle damage and stuff all over this guy. So just going around here and just being quite careful. I've had 5 coffees by this point and I am buzzing my tits off, so excuse me if my hands are shaking a little bit here. Not ideal for doing a painting tutorial, but coffee is life, death before decaf. Again, make sure you catch all the rivets on this, not to be confused with ribbits, which are a type of frog noise. All right, the camera keeps going out of focus, which is really, really helpful. So hopefully you can see that now, but yeah, looking pretty good now that we've done that Pallid witch flesh. The next thing that we're going to do actually is add a pop of color. So I said I wouldn't, but I'm gonna add a little bit of color here, and my favorite color when it comes to Games Workshop, or Citadel should I say, contrast paints, is this beautiful red here. Flesh Tearers Red. Absolutely my favorite color in the contrast line, I have to say. And what I'm going to do here is do the helmet and the fists underneath the armor plates. So not the actual armor plates on the fists, but the fists and fingers themselves in a deep sort of blood red on this guy. Just have a little bit of a splash of color on an otherwise fairly drab looking model. I'm super happy with the ruby dark red that's popping on this guy in an otherwise very drab model. I think a splash of color is needed. Not too much, just a little bit, and I'm glad I did it on the fists as well. I was always going to do the helmet. The next thing I'm going to do now, though, is any of the sort of metal details. What I don't want to do is go over the top with metal. I want to keep most of the model this sort of off-white bone color. So really all I'm doing here is the nozzles on the bolt spitter over the shoulder there, and a couple of key details on the backpack, as well as the clips on the back of those pipes coming off the fists as well. There really aren't many other areas of this model that I want to do in a different color. Like I said, a sort of 80% of this model is going to be at least that bone armor color. All right, I've done all the gunmetal areas on this, the dark metal here. Nothing fancy with this. I'm not even going to highlight it. I'm going to wash it later, though. The next thing we're going to do is a quick little bit of an edge highlight with Wild Rider Red, I believe it is, on those red areas, just catching the sort of lip, the rim on the helmet there, and any little rivets that I see, as well as the knuckles on the power fists there as well. Not too much. Don't want to go overboard. I don't like to over highlight things because I just feel like it just stands out too much and doesn't look too realistic. We're going for really simple and effective looking color here. Just catching those knuckles with the Wild Rider Red, and any little areas where the light might hit from above, we're catching it with the red just to make it pop a little bit more. All right, we've done that little edge highlight there. I know I said I don't like to edge highlight, but you know, sometimes you gotta. The next thing I'm gonna do here is wash all of the gun metal here with Agrax Earthshade. Now, this is pretty simple to do. Just coat all of those metal areas, being careful again not to splash this onto that nice crispy looking armor at the moment, which won't be so crispy in a second when we get into the next bit, but just I think using the Agrax Earthshade is preferable in this instance to Nuln Oil. You could use Nuln Oil, but I'd rather stick with all the browns that we've got going on in this theme here. Lots of different browns, no blacks so far. All right, we're looking pretty clean so far. The wash, the Agrax Earthshade, I've used on the metal here. I did just do a bit of Black Templar on those pipes on the back of the Power Fists here as well off camera, so I do apologise for that. The next thing I'm going to do though is grab some Dryad Bark, which is a nice medium sort of warm brown, and I'm going to get a little sponge. I'm going to do some stippling and some battle damage on the cream armour. In fact, on the whole miniature, to be honest. Now, this is a very simple technique. It can be very effective, but you can go completely overboard on it. So just be really, really careful. You can always add more. Less is more, though, quite often with these things. There have been many situations where I've gone absolutely ham on this stage and pretty much had to dial it back a little bit by going back in again with another sponge with the base color to try and bring things back to the original. So what we're doing here is just using a very sort of rough edge of this piece of foam here and just dotting the edges, very lightly touching and tapping the edges with the sponge with that Dryad Bark on it. Now I want to do a little bit more on the sort of knuckles and the fist areas, as well as the sort of edges of the armor plating as well, so that we have some realistic looking battle damage. This is the only stippling we're going to do here. And again, it is a very simple process. If you haven't done this before, make sure that you're just very careful with it. That's my only sort of advice there. You can always add more. So yeah, just keep it minimal to start with, and just, you know, occasionally take breaks, look at it, see if it needs some more. If it does, add some more. If you're happy with it, then just leave it. Don't go over the top. All right, we're looking pretty good now. Again, the armor is still quite bright. We're going to certainly make it a lot darker and dirtier looking. And the next sort of stage that I'm going to do here is going to be quite an interesting one. As you can see, all that battle damage is looking pretty good with the Dryad Bark there. You could use different colors. You could use a metal color, but I just went with Dryad Bark because it's a nice medium one. We're going to use Dirty Down Rust now next, and we're going to use it in a way that I've never used before. So this could go horribly wrong, or it could go well, but the thing about painting, I think, is to take risks. It's worth taking risks because, you know, you're never going to know unless you do it. So what I'm going to do with this is actually use the Dirty Down Rust as a wash all over the armor. Now, the way that I'm doing this is pretty haphazard. What I've done here is actually use the lid, the remnants of some of the Dirty Down Rust that's in the lid after I shook it very thoroughly, and then I'm adding probably 5 or 6 big brushfuls of water so that I get a sort of wash consistency. Now, Dirty Down Rust is an amazing product. You can use it in so many ways, but again, I do see people overusing it a lot. You can use it in tons of different ways on scenery, but, you know, essentially, when you mix it with water, that's when it activates and it forms rusty areas. Now, the more water you add to it, the more light the rust effect is going to be. The less water you add to it, the darker and deeper that rust is going to look. So what we're going to do here is just coat the entire miniature, including the red actually, and the metal, with this Dirty Down Rust wash, which is pretty watered down. I want to say 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part Dirty Down on this. And you're going to need this to dry. What I've done here, because I live in Sydney and it's nice and sunny and hot today, is after I've applied this, I've actually gone and put the miniature out in the sun so that it can dry and form those nice rusty effects. A bit of warmth or even a hairdryer, if you live in a cold place, can really set this really nicely and bring about that beautiful rusty patina effect that you get with Dirty Down Rust. Once you unlock the potential of Dirty Down Rust, it really is just such an awesome tool. Now you can see that this guy has dried. It's looking pretty awesome. Now that armor is definitely a lot darker at this point. What I did actually off camera as well with some pure Dirty Down Rust and a fine brush is go in and just fill in all the rivets and deep sort of recesses here with that Dirty Down Rust, just to add a little bit more pop in the areas that I think would be more rusty realistically. The next thing I'm going to do is coat the entire thing in a cheap spray gloss varnish. This is going to lock everything in. It's going to seal that dirty down rust so that we don't later activate it with more paint or water. He's looking pretty good at this stage. He's certainly very shiny. Again, that's what the gloss varnish will do. I quite like the shiny look at this stage, but we're going to make things very matte by the end because I think the matte varnish that I'm going to use at the end, that I'm going to show you how to use that, is just fantastic. So we're going to go over the base now with another contrast paint, another brown in fact, and this one is Gore Grunter Fur. Silly name, that one, but I do like it. It's a nice warm brown. It's quite a sort of reddish brown. I like to use this one as a skin tone, actually. It's quite a nice one as a skin tone, or even as leathers as well. I haven't actually decided what I'm going to do with the base past this point, whether I'm going to have a darker base or a lighter base or what color I'm going to go for. I'm going to use pigments in the end though, so we'll have to wait and see. But I thought I'd just coat it all in a sort of mid-brown in the interim while that gloss varnish is setting. All right, now we're at the sort of final stage now already. You know, this was a very, very simple process and it's looking wicked. What we're going to do here is do an oil wash, a very, very minimal oil wash. Again, we're going to water this down with odorless mineral spirits. Find a plastic lid or a cup or something to do this in, and definitely put down some paper towel because this will get everywhere. I'm just going to use an old brush here and take a tiny little bit of oil paint, burnt umber in this case, and just mix it with, again, I'm probably going to say sort of 5 or 6 parts odorless mineral spirits to that little part of burnt umber oil paint there as well, making sure that it's all mixed in nice and thin and doesn't have any chunks of oil paint in there as well. So I'm actually going to just wipe the brush off a little bit so to make sure that we haven't got any chunks in there, because that can be really annoying if you get a few little chunks on the model. Then we're going to liberally wash it over the entire model and get into all those cracks and crevices and creases. This is going to bring everything together and add an extra level of depth to the miniature. I think this step, you could miss out on this step, but I think that even just a very light oil wash here really is going to add an extra level of matteness to it and realism, but also, again, just to reiterate, it will really sort of bring everything together a little bit more and go into those recesses and make all those armor panels really nicely pop. Now, I have spilt this stuff on the carpet before. I actually spilt an entire tub of burnt umber wash onto a cream brand new rug and it was horrendous. So just be really, really careful. But you can then go through with cotton buds and just wipe off the excess. You can dip this in a little bit of clean mineral spirits as well, and it will take off a bit more of the paint. In this case though, I'm just taking off that extra sort of residue that sits on it. And again, I'm working from sort of up to down motions on this. I don't want to go up at all. I just want to go down with the cotton bud to make sure that any of those greasy, grimy, juicy little bits that we get are going downwards with gravity and creating that nice realistic sort of dirty effect on this model. I'm just using just the 1 or 2 cotton buds here. You don't need to use too much, but again, just don't rub it too hard. Yes, you have sealed it all in with the varnish, so this really helps this process. It also, by the way, the varnish, I find, prevents the sort of paint being coloured by the oil paint. If you don't do the varnish step, something I've noticed is it will dark things down even more than you want. So definitely the varnish is good for that. The next thing I'm going to do is I've just put a little bit of white scar on the lamps there. I'm then going to go in with some Ethermatic Blue contrast paint and just sort of touch up those lamps just for a tiny weeny little accent of colour, which is different to the rest of those warm reds and browns that we've got. We've got a cold sort of turquoise blue here. I'm not going to do any sort of OSL on this because, quite frankly, I'm not very good at that. So I'm just going to do a very minimal sort of effect on the lamps here with some white scar underneath and some Ethermatic Blue washed all over the entire lamp. Looking pretty boss. The last sort of stage that we're going to do here is, of course, the base. There's not really much more to do with this, but we're going to do the base next, and I'm going to be using some pigments here. The first pigment I'm going to use, I've never, honestly, if you've seen any of my other painting jobs or tutorials, I nearly always use orange bases for Necromunda. For this though, I thought I'd go with something different because there is a lot of orange going on the model already pretty much. So I'm going to use a bit of white, titanium white pigment powder here and see if it works. We're just going to put the old sort of dry, making sure this brush is dry by the way. If it's damp at all it won't work very well. We're just going to dab this around the base and onto the feet to create a sort of ash wastes. By the way, we don't really know what colour the ash is in the ash waste, but I'm going to assume it's a sort of white grey sort of colour, but that's what we're going for here, and let's see if it works. Don't use too much powder at once, just use little bits and keep dabbing it around to your heart's content until you feel like you've got enough on. Make sure to put some on the boots and the shoes. You know, I could go a bit higher with it, up the legs maybe, but I think in this case we're going to keep it fairly minimal. I don't want to sort of hide any of the effect on the armor that I've got so far. Again though, put a paper towel down here and try not to breathe in any of that pigment as well, because it's not very good for your lungs, I hear. So at this point I've pretty much coated the whole of the top of the base with that white pigment powder and some of the shoes and the heels of the shoes as well, just to give that sort of realism of this guy striding through the ash wastes. The next thing we're going to do here is do the rim of the base. Now you could use Goblin Green if you're particularly old school, and I respect you for that, but I grew up a little while ago and now I use Abaddon Black for my bases. So, you know, get with the program, use black, makes the rest of the model look a lot better. You could use brown here. I've actually used sort of dark brown like the Dryad Bark before on bases, which looks quite nice, but I think for Necromunda, for that grimdark effect, you're really going to want a nice black, strong, matte rim on the base just to make everything else pop. I always do 2 passes of this, by the way, because I find that particularly if there's sort of like grey or white underneath, you do get those little streaks. So just be really careful working your way around with this not to get it onto the top of the base or, heaven forbid, any of the rest of the model. We're going to go around and do 2 passes of this black on the rim. This spray is quite expensive, but I think it gives it a really hard, gorgeous matte effect, and I'm really happy with the results generally. It'll also lock in those pigments and just finish the model really nicely. Okay, so here is the finished result of my Squat Exo-Kyn Prospector. He's looking pretty boss, let's be honest. I'm really happy with the results here, particularly on the armor and the red. Yes, I admit I probably could have done a better job with the base and perhaps the lamps as well, but the rest of the model I'm really happy with, and I actually can't wait to paint the rest of my squats up in this theme using that little sort of accent color of red on them. I think is really going to work nicely, and they're going to look great with the rest of my terrain as well. So if you like this video, please do like, share, subscribe, and comment down below as well. Let me know what you think of this. Would you use this scheme on your own Squat Prospectors, or perhaps even your Horus Heresy Death Guard or something similar like that? I could see people using this in a few different ways. So I hope this was helpful. I will be back with another painting tutorial real soon. Peace out.